90%. That is the survival rate for a surgical procedure performed 5,000 years ago in the hills of what we now call France, involving a patient having two large holes bored directly into their skull with a piece of sharpened flint. In a world with zero access to synthetic antibiotics, zero knowledge of germ theory, and zero sterile environments, that number doesn't just sound wrong, it sounds like a statistical impossibility. If you walked into a leading London hospital in the year 1840, your chances of surviving a major surgery were significantly lower than they were for a Neolithic farmer 5 millennia earlier. This creates a paradox that challenges everything we think we know about the progression of human health. We tend to view the history of medicine as a straight line moving from darkness and superstition toward light and science, but the deeper we dig into the archaeological record, the more we realize that our ancestors were playing a very different and surprisingly sophisticated game of survival. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for a double-blind clinical trial. They had the brutal, immediate laboratory of natural selection. The first thing we have to dismantle is the comforting myth of the short, thuggish life. You have probably heard the statistic that the average life expectancy for an ancient human was somewhere around 30 years old. While that number is technically accurate in a mathematical sense, and I should mention, mathematics can be a very deceptive lens for history, it is a total distortion of reality. That average is heavily weighted by the tragic reality of infant mortality. If an ancient human survived the perilous journey of childhood, they didn't just drop dead on their 30th birthday. Research published in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior by anthropologists Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan shows that if a hunter-gatherer made it to age 15, they were most likely going to live until their late 60s or even their mid-70s. This realization changes the entire framework of how we look at ancient sickness. If people were living 7 decades, they weren't just surviving the occasional cold, they were managing chronic conditions, recovering from massive physical trauma, and outlasting pathogens that we struggle to contain today. They were doing this without a single pharmacy in sight, which suggests that their medicine cabinet was far larger and more complex than we ever dared to imagine. Imagine you are standing in a dense forest 50,000 years ago, and you are starting to feel the telltale ache of an infection. You don't have a doctor to call, but you have something perhaps even more valuable: millions of years of observation. This is where we encounter the field of zoopharmacognosy, the study of how animals self-medicate. For a long time, we assumed humans were the only species clever enough to use nature as a pharmacy, but we were wrong. In 2022, researchers working on the Longo chimpanzee project in Gabon observed something that completely shifted our understanding of ancient medical origins. They watched a female chimpanzee named Suzy catch a flying insect, crush it between her lips, and then apply it to an open wound on her son's foot. They observed this behavior dozens of times across the community. They weren't eating the insects for calories, they were using them as a topical ointment. This wasn't a learned behavior from humans, it was a deeply ingrained biological drive. Our ancestors didn't invent the idea of medicine out of thin air. They watched the creatures around them. They saw bears digging up and eating osha roots to treat respiratory issues, and they saw pregnant elephants traveling miles out of their way to eat specific leaves from trees in the Boraginaceae family to induce labor. Early humans were the ultimate students of the natural world, and they realized that if a plant could change the behavior of an animal, it could probably change the outcome of a human life. Now, strictly speaking, and this is where the chemistry gets fascinating, these early humans were interacting with the secondary metabolites of plants. Unlike the primary metabolites that a plant needs to grow, secondary metabolites are the chemical weapons plants develop to keep themselves from being eaten. They are poisons, but as the old saying goes, the only difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. Our ancestors spent thousands of years calibrating that dose through a high-stakes process of trial and error. But they weren't just using plants. They were using the earth itself. There is a behavior called geophagy, the eating of clay and earth, which is often dismissed today as a nutritional deficiency or a psychological disorder. However, if we look back at the origins of human health, we see that eating specific types of clay like kaolin or bentonite was a stroke of medical genius. These clays have a unique molecular structure that allows them to bind to toxins in the digestive tract, effectively acting as a primitive form of charcoal filtration. When an early human accidentally ate a toxic berry or a piece of spoiled meat, the clay acted as a sponge, pulling the poison out of their system before it could enter the bloodstream. They didn't need to understand the molecular bonding of silicate minerals to know that eating the white earth made the stomach cramps go away. It was a pre-scientific solution to a universal problem, and it worked so well that versions of it are still used in modern anti-diarrheal medications today. But how do you survive when the sickness isn't in your stomach, but in your very bones? This leads us back to the paradox of the 90% survival rate. Trepanation, the act of cutting a hole in the skull, is the oldest documented surgical procedure in human history, and its success rate is hauntingly high. If you look at the Ensisheim site in France, dated to around 5000 BC, you find a male skull with 2 perfectly healed surgical openings. The bone has regrown around the edges, a process that takes months if not years, proving that the patient lived a long and presumably productive life after the surgery. This wasn't a desperate act of violence, it was a calculated medical intervention. Researchers believe it was used to treat everything from intracranial pressure caused by trauma to chronic migraines and epilepsy. But the real question is how they managed the infection. This is where we find the hidden medicine of the ancient world. They used things like honey and propolis, a resinous mixture that bees collect from tree buds. We now know that honey has a high osmolarity and produces hydrogen peroxide, making it one of the most effective natural antibiotics on the planet. By coating a surgical wound in honey or propolis, ancient surgeons were inadvertently creating a sterile barrier that prevented the very infections that would kill millions of people in European hospitals thousands of years later. They were practicing advanced wound care without knowing what a bacterium was, guided by the simple, repeatable observation that the sweet glue from the hives kept the rot away. If this sounds like a lucky series of accidents, we have to consider the social architecture of survival. Ancient humans survived sickness because they didn't get sick alone. In 2017, a study of a Neanderthal burial site known as Shanidar 1 revealed the remains of a man who had suffered a massive blow to the side of his head in his youth, likely leaving him blind in one eye. His right arm was withered and had been amputated at the elbow, and he had severe deformities in his legs. He was, by every metric of a harsh hunter-gatherer environment, a liability. And yet, he lived into his late 40s. He survived for 30 years after his debilitating injuries because his tribe carried him. They fed him, they cleaned his wounds, and they protected him from predators. This is a form of medical care that has nothing to do with plants or stones, but everything to do with the evolution of empathy. We often think of survival of the fittest as the survival of the strongest individual, but for humans, the fittest was the group that was best at keeping its members alive. This social safety net was our most potent antibiotic. It allowed the sick the time and resources they needed to recover, rather than being forced to choose between the hunt and the grave. However, there is a darker side to this survival story, one that involves a silent war we are still fighting today. We have to talk about the behavioral immune system. Long before our bodies developed the internal antibodies to fight off a specific virus, our brains developed the emotion of disgust. Think about the last time you saw something slimy or smelled something rotting and your stomach did a somersault. That isn't just a random feeling, it is a sophisticated survival mechanism. Evolution programmed us to find certain things gross because those things, feces, rotting meat, stagnant water, are the primary vectors for parasites and pathogens. Ancient humans who felt the strongest sense of disgust were the ones who stayed away from the contaminated water source and lived to pass on their genes. We survived sickness by developing a psychological barrier that kept the sickness at arm's length. This also extended to social grooming. When you see monkeys picking lice off each other, it looks like a social bonding exercise, and it is, but it is also a vital medical checkup. By removing ectoparasites before they could burrow into the skin and transmit blood-borne diseases, our ancestors were practicing preventative medicine. They were keeping the inventory of their health high by constantly monitoring the physical state of their tribe members. And mind you, this wasn't just about looking for bugs, it was about the very air they breathed. One of the most significant medical breakthroughs in human history wasn't a pill, but the control of fire. We usually think of fire in terms of warmth or cooking, but its medical impact was arguably more important. Fire allowed for the sterilization of water and the cauterization of wounds. More importantly, the move toward smoky caves and huts actually provided a primitive form of pest control. The smoke from certain woods, like cedar or juniper, acts as a natural insecticide, driving away the mosquitoes and flies that carry malaria, sleeping sickness, and the plague. Our ancestors weren't just sitting around a campfire for the vibes. They were sitting in a chemical cloud that protected them from the most prolific killers in human history. They were using smoke as an airborne shield, creating a safe zone where the tiny, biting vectors of death couldn't reach them. But here is where the story takes a counterintuitive turn, one that might make you look at your modern, sanitized life with a bit of suspicion. There is a concept in modern immunology called the old friends hypothesis, proposed by Dr. Graham Rook in the early 2000s. It suggests that ancient humans survived sickness not just by fighting it, but by living in a state of constant, low-level engagement with it. Because our ancestors were constantly exposed to soil bacteria, gut parasites, and various non-lethal viruses, their immune systems were trained from birth. They had a balanced inflammatory response. In our modern world, where we have scrubbed everything with bleach and eliminated the old friends, the parasites and bacteria we evolved with, our immune systems have become bored and hyperreactive, leading to the explosion of autoimmune diseases and allergies. Ancient humans didn't have hay fever or Crohn's disease because their immune systems were too busy dealing with the real threats. They lived in a world that was dirty by our standards, but that dirt was the very thing that primed their bodies to survive major infections. They were robust because they were challenged. As we move toward the final pieces of this puzzle, we have to look at how they handled the most universal symptom of all, the fever. For most of the 20th century, the medical consensus was that a fever was a problem that needed to be broken. We reached for aspirin and cool cloths the moment the temperature spiked. But ancient humans, guided by intuition and observation, often did the opposite. In many indigenous cultures, a person with a fever is wrapped in furs and placed near a fire. They didn't try to stop the heat, they helped it. We now understand that a fever is a highly evolved defense mechanism. By raising the body's internal temperature, the immune system creates an environment where many pathogens cannot reproduce. It also speeds up the production of white blood cells and the activity of enzymes that fight infection. Our ancestors survived because they didn't fight the body's natural defenses. They leaned into them. They understood that the discomfort of the fever was the sound of the body's war machine spinning up to full power. They trusted the heat, and more often than not, the heat saved them. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, the one that sits at the heart of our ancestral survival. We often imagine ancient humans as being at the mercy of a cruel and random world, but they were actually the beneficiaries of a massive, decentralized intelligence. Every time someone died from eating the wrong leaf, that death was recorded in the collective memory of the tribe. Every time someone survived a surgery, that technique was refined and passed down through oral tradition. They didn't have textbooks, but they had stories, and in those stories, the data of survival was encoded. The shaman or the medicine woman wasn't just a spiritual figure, they were the hard drive of the community. They were the ones who held the 50,000-year-old database of which bark stops the bleeding and which root brings the sleep. When we look at their survival rates, we aren't looking at luck. We are looking at the result of the longest-running experiment in human history. If you find yourself wondering how they did it, just look at the tools they left behind. When archaeologists find a Neolithic skull with a perfectly healed trepanation hole, they aren't just looking at a piece of bone. They are looking at the proof of a complex society that valued its members enough to perform high-stakes surgery. They are looking at the proof of a chemical knowledge that predates the periodic table. And they are looking at the proof that our ancestors were far more like us than we care to admit. They were scared, they were in pain, but they were incredibly, stubbornly clever. They didn't have the science of the how, but they had the wisdom of the what. They knew what worked because they were the ones who had outlived everything that didn't. But there is a final, lingering thought that changes the perspective on our own modern health. We have spent the last century trying to eliminate sickness entirely, to create a world where nothing hurts and nothing is gross. We have succeeded in ways our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. But in doing so, we have also disconnected ourselves from the very environment that built our resilience. We have traded the old friends for a life of sterile comfort, and we are only now beginning to realize what we might have lost in the exchange. Our ancestors didn't just survive sickness, they were shaped by it. It was the whetstone that sharpened our immune systems, our minds, and our social structures. Without the constant threat of the pathogen, we wouldn't be the species we are today. We are the survivors of a million-year war, and the scars of that war are written into our very DNA. Think about that 90% survival rate for brain surgery again. It's a number that keeps historians up at night because it suggests that we haven't actually gotten that much smarter, we've just gotten better tools. The intelligence, the bravery, and the capacity for care were all there, fully formed, 5,000 years ago. We aren't a new kind of human because we have MRI machines and penicillin. We are the same humans, using a different version of the same sweet glue and sharpened stones. Our survival isn't a result of our modern genius. It's a legacy we inherited from people who didn't even know what a cell was, but who knew exactly what it felt like to fight for one more day in the sun. Actually, when you think about it, the most remarkable thing isn't that they survived, it's that they thrived. They built civilizations, they painted masterpieces on cave walls, and they mapped the stars, all while managing the constant, shifting threats of a world teeming with invisible killers. They didn't see sickness as an error in the system, they saw it as part of the system itself. They didn't try to live forever. They just tried to live long enough to pass on the secret of the white clay and the honey-coated bandage. And because they did, you are here to hear this story. You are the end result of 50,000 years of successful medical interventions, most of which were performed in the dark, over a fire, with nothing but a prayer and a piece of flint. Next time you feel a fever coming on, or you reach for a bandage, remember that you aren't just using a product of the 21st century. You are participating in a ritual of survival that is older than the written word. You are part of a chain of healers and survivors that stretches back to that chimpanzee in Gabon and that wounded man in the Iraqi cave. It's a history that is often messy, sometimes terrifying, but always, fundamentally, human. We have always been healers. We have always been patients. And we have always, against all odds, found a way to pull each other back from the edge. It is a sobering thought to realize that the most advanced medical technology we possess today, the ability to edit genes and target tumors with lasers, is just the latest chapter in a book that was started by someone chewing on a piece of bitter root. We haven't left the cave, we've just brought more lights into it. The struggle remains the same, and the stakes haven't changed. We are still trying to outrun the microscopic predators that want to turn our bodies into their own survival stories. And if history is any indication, we will keep finding new ways to win, just as our ancestors did with their sharpened rocks and their smoke-filled rooms. But before we close this investigation, there is one detail from the archaeological record that should haunt your modern sensibilities. In many of those trepan skulls, those patients who survived the holes in their heads for years, scientists found something curious. The holes weren't just left open. In several cases, the missing piece of bone had been carefully saved, polished into a smooth disc, and worn as an amulet by another member of the tribe. It wasn't just a piece of debris, it was a relic. It was definitive, physical proof that the sickness had been faced, the bone had been cut, and the human had survived. To them, the scar wasn't a mark of shame or weakness, it was the most powerful protection they could imagine. It was a reminder that even when the world tries to bore a hole in you, there is a way to heal, to regrow, and to keep walking. That amulet is the ultimate CTA from our ancestors. It's a prompt to look at our own vulnerabilities not as failures, but as the very things that connect us to the people around us. If you've ever wondered how you would have fared in that ancient world, perhaps the answer lies in how you treat the people in your life today when they are at their weakest. Medicine has always been more about the group than the individual. If this deep dive into the impossible survival of our ancestors changed the way you look at a simple bandage or a fever, I'd love to hear which of these ancient methods surprised you the most. Was it the 90% survival rate of Stone Age brain surgery, or the fact that chimps are out there practicing wound care? Drop a thought in the comments. I genuinely read them to see what sparked your curiosity. And if you want to keep exploring these hidden corners of human history, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be digging into more of these rabbit holes, and it's a lot safer to do it together than alone. After all, the tribe is how we survive.